Good evening and welcome to South Orange Public Library. We are here today with Maisy Card, who is the author of These Ghosts Are Family. My name is Keisha Miller and I'm the Teen Librarian here at South Orange Public Library. And I'm so delighted to have a fellow Teen Librarian as well join us. Whether you've read the book or not, it is a story that is rich in culture, that is told from a point of view that I think you could relate to, certainly if you are of Jamaican or Caribbean heritage, but even if you aren't, it's something I think that will certainly intrigue you. And so I am delighted to have Maisy Card here, and so you all can welcome her with an applause at home. If we had people here, we would certainly do that. And so I'm glad that you all can join us via Zoom. What I will ask of everybody is to, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. And towards the end of our discussion, we can get to a few of those questions. And my colleague, who's behind the scenes, Michael Pucci, will be able to relay those questions to us. So if you have a question, put it in the chat. And if you find it difficult to understand us, just raise your hand and we can give some kind of a cue. Maybe Michael, you can come on screen or indicate to us that we need to adjust our speech because we are here practicing social distancing behind a mask, okay? So, without further ado, Maisy Card is here again, debut novel of These Ghosts Are Family. Maisy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I am so very happy. I can tell you I am not an author, so I'm not a writer, and certainly being in the same field, what inspired you to become a writer?
I actually decided to become a writer because I'm also a librarian. I decided to become a writer before I decided to become a librarian. I decided to become a writer when I was 16, actually, when I was like in 10th grade, and I would like remember the exact moment. It was, my 10th grade English teacher had assigned us to read the short story by Flannery O'Connor called Everything That Rises Must Converge. And this, for people who haven't read it, the story is set during the, after buses were integrated, basically when black people stopped having to sit at the back of the bus in the South, and the two main characters are, this white mother and son, and basically, the son is more liberal, and so he kind of plays this kind of mental game with his mother, with the black people on the bus, in relation to the black people on the bus. And so our teacher had given us that story and then asked us to write a story from the perspective of a character who doesn't speak. And so I rewrote the story from the point of view of a black character in the story, watching the mother and her son. So after that, I just had never really tried to write before, and I just liked the way it felt, and I liked the feeling of giving voice to somebody who doesn't speak in the story. And so after that I decided to become a writer. I picked a college because it was known for having good writing teachers there. I went and got an MFA after I graduated. I got an MFA in 2000. I finished in 2009, which is where I started this book. And then right after I went to get an MLS and became a librarian.
So this story is 11 years in the making? 10 years in the making,
like almost 12. Because
Wow.
like if you count revisions, done after it was sold. So,
Yes, and so you mentioned, writing from the perspective of the character in the book, and you mentioned also giving a voice to these characters. I think you did that beautifully in this novel, and I'll get to that. If I don't, do remind me.
Okay.
But I am interested to share some of your work with our audience. Would you mind doing a little reading?
Sure. I'm just going to read the beginning of the book. I'll show it. So for people who haven't gotten a chance to read it, The book starts out with the family patriarch. This book is about a Jamaican family, the Paisleys, and so the family patriarch in 1970, Abel Paisley, he basically faked his own death. He took advantage of a situation to let his family in Jamaica believe that he died, and he assumed the identity of his best friend, Stanford Solomon. So in the present day, when the story begins, Stanford is about to make a confession to his daughter that he fathered in America, his granddaughter, and then also the daughter who actually believes he's dead and hasn't seen him since she was a toddler. So I'm just going to read the first part. It's divided in, the first chapter is kind of told in second person and divided into multiple sections, and I'm going to read the first section. So the first chapter is called The True Death of Abel Paisley, and it's set in Harlem in 2005. Let's say that you are a 69-year-old Jamaican man called Stanford, or Stan for short, who once faked your own death, though you have never used those words to describe what you did. At the time, you thought of it as seizing an opportunity placed before you by God. But since your wife, Adele, died a month ago, you convinced yourself her heart attack was retribution for your sin. So today, you have gathered 3 of your female descendants in one house, even the daughter who has thought you dead all these years, and decided that you will finally tell them the truth. You are not who you say you are. You have spent the last 20 years of your second life living in a brownstone in Harlem, running a West Indian grocery store. Recently, you shuttered the store. You have given up fighting your arthritis pain and are finally sitting in the wheelchair Adele picked out. You are looking out of your parlor window, waiting for your daughter, the one who thinks you are dead, to arrive. It's been 35 years since you've seen her, so you study each woman who passes your house for reflections of yourself. You haven't bothered to shave, press your clothes, or comb your hair. You are ready to be still and rot. You imagine the death of Stanford Solomon, unlike the abrupt end of Abel Paisley, will be achingly slow. Already it feels like you are losing small pieces of yourself daily. To you, old age is the torture you deserve, a slow, insignificant death, your matter dispersing into the air like dandelion seeds until the day there's nothing left. When you died the first time, you were still a young man in your 30s and had been working in England for less than a year. It wasn't easy for an immigrant, especially a black man, to find a decent job back then. But through a boy you'd known back in primary school, Stanford, you'd gotten a room and a job on a ship. You had no idea it was just the beginning of your streak of good luck. You and Stanford were the chosen wogs they allowed to work alongside the white men. Stanford complained often about London. He hated the cold. He missed his grandmother and the tiny village, Harold Town, where you'd both grown up back in Jamaica. You'd already escaped the countryside for Kingston, and from there, London. You felt free. That sense of freedom and joy only dampened when you thought of the family you left behind. Your first wife, Vera, wrote you long letters weekly about how you'd abandoned her and left her to become a dried-up old spinster. But you both knew perfectly well that it was her idea for you to go to England, where she thought you'd somehow become a better provider. Your son, Vincent, was still in Vera's womb when you sailed off. Your daughter, Irene, a stumbling toddler. You had barely settled in when Vera's first letter arrived with a list of things she wanted you to buy and send to them. With every letter, the list grew longer, and you worried that you would never be enough. The day you died, you were running along the dock because you were late for work while a container was being lowered onto the ship. You stopped short when the container fell, dropped from the crane, and thundered against the deck. You were close enough to hear the screaming. "Who was it?" you heard someone shout. "One of the wogs," another answered. "It's Abel." For a moment you were confused, hearing yourself pronounced dead. It was like one of those movies where the dead person's spirit stands by watching as a crowd gathers around his body. But no, you were certain it wasn't your body, so you boarded the ship. The captain approached you immediately and said, "I'm sorry, mate. No way Abel could have survived that." You almost laugh now when you think of it. The one time racism worked in your favor. The captain had gotten his wogs confused, looked you right in the eye, and mistaken you for the other black guy. Abel was dead, crushed under the container, unrecognizable, but you, Stanford now, could turn and go home. Perhaps it's telling about your nature that you did not hesitate. You nodded and turned and walked away quickly from Abel and all of his responsibilities before any of the others had a chance to recognize you. Back in your room at the boarding house, you rifled through your roommate's things and learned what it really meant to be Stanford. You and Stanford actually did look alike, which made it a little easier to forgive the fact that all the white people had trouble telling you apart. You were the same height, the same light brown complexion, the same lanky build. You, Abel, did not arrive dressed for an English winter, so you had even taken to wearing Stanford's clothes. Of course, you thought of your family, your wife, Vera. You thought about the 2 life insurance policies you'd purchased, the one she made you take out before you left and the one the company made mandatory. You decided you were worth more to her dead. Vera was beautiful. She would find a new husband, a richer one. The children were young enough to embrace a new father, and they would finally live the life that Vera thought that she deserved, the one she had no qualms about constantly demanding of you. Stanford had little family, no wife, no children. That was what clinched things for you. Stanford was raised by his grandmother, who was in her 70s and losing her eyesight. You could continue writing her letters, sending her a little money, and there was no bother there. What surprised you was how right it felt, at least then. When you met Adele, shortly after you became Stanford, you connected with her immediately. Like you, she was a Jamaican and had left her family to work in England. Though at 19, she was almost 15 years younger than you. You were as drawn to her as you had been to your first wife, and she to you. The difference was that Adele did not try to remake and mold you. When you told her the truth, the very first night you spent together, that you had taken your friend's name, she did not try to dissuade you. Instead, she avoided the subject until you proposed, and she said yes on the condition that you live in America, as if leaving that country would leave the lie behind. Later, the guilt would hit her first. A few years after coming to the US, she had started to go to church multiple times a week and suggested that you atone. You remember having laughed at the thought that getting down on your knees could redeem you. But since the day that she collapsed in the store, you've been thinking about your past. You've been thinking about that word, fake, and you decided you were right to never use it to describe what you've done. You are a thief, pure and simple. It wasn't Stanford's life you had stolen, for he would have lost that regardless. It was his death. Where is his soul now, circling the world, looking for a grave that does not yet exist? Isn't it about time you gave him his due? Your granddaughter has taught you how to use the computer to kill some of your idle time. It was easier than you thought to find your first daughter, to track her journey from Jamaica to New York. You are thinking of the grave that bears your real name and all of the people who needlessly mourned you when Irene finally arrives, the daughter who thinks you are dead. She is under the impression that she has been called to your house to care for an old man in a wheelchair. That old man is you. You didn't realize just how little you've thought about her all these years until you watch her climb the stoop, and all the feeling you should have had for your firstborn suddenly rushes through you. When she enters, you see her mother Vera's wide, obstinate mouth, her large, slightly bulbous hazel eyes, her nostrils flaring. You can sense immediately, before she even speaks, that she has her mother's brutal tongue. You are intimidated. She has a look that says she's afraid rope, one tug away from snapping, and it occurs to you to wonder if, when you tell her the truth, she will kill you. In that moment, your death, Your real death flashes in your mind. You have never had a premonition before, but now the certainty of it causes you to slump forward in your wheelchair. You have a vision of a woman supporting your weight as you make your way up this flight of stairs, bringing you all the way to the top and then just letting you go, as if she just remembered she was supposed to be somewhere else. Your daughter, who moments before had introduced herself as Irene, the name you gave her, bends down and asks, "You all right, Mr. Solomon?" You sit up straight, or as straight as an old man with scoliosis and arthritis can, and say, "You can call me Stanford."
Woo. When I tell you, you open up this book and you read that, and of course you read a little bit more until you finish the book, it is a page turner. I have to ask you, for me, I immediately started thinking about my own family and about the many, many families around. Are there families like this that are built this way, that have secrets? Yes, there are families like this that have secrets, that they don't want to even discuss certain things. You and I, being from the same generation, I think we're a bit more vocal in our opinion, and we don't want to bother with things that are necessarily quote-unquote taboo. We just kind of go for it. I find it awfully frustrating when people don't want to discuss things simply because it's not the way we do it. And I think Caribbean culture, specifically Jamaican culture, that is true. There's truth behind that. What inspired you to come up with such a story like this? Because I feel, as a reader, I felt like you had written an open letter, kind of bringing awareness to our culture through this form. What you could have written anything. What inspired you to write a story that not necessarily exposes anybody, but with this in mind? You could have written anything else.
I think when I started writing, actually, it's not the official start of when I began the novel, but actually in college, I did take a creative nonfiction class, and it turned out to be the best writing class I've ever taken. Because I think before that, for some reason, I didn't feel like I had the permission to write about my family. I don't know, or people who were like me. I wasn't writing stories about Jamaican people for some reason. And I think a lot of writers of color used to do this, before publishing recently started to diversify drastically. I think you just kind of felt like you had to write about these kind of racially ambiguous characters that you thought, would appeal to publishers. And so I don't know, I mean, it wasn't anything that I intentionally set out to do, but when I think back to those stories that I wrote in my fiction classes in college, I realized that they didn't look like anybody I actually knew, and they were very almost disembodied, because I would never say this is a black character.
Right.
So when I took a creative nonfiction class and I started to write these essays about my family, my professor, her name was Elizabeth Boberick, she's a creative nonfiction writer, was saying these essays are really alive. So I think it seemed a little tricky to write creative nonfiction and to publish personal essays about my family, but later when I started the MFA, I did start to fictionalize kind of some memories, or just people that I had met. So this novel started as a series of short stories that I wrote when I was in the MFA, and it didn't start out being connected at first. It didn't start out being one family. It was just, I wanted to write stories about Jamaican people, and so, I think when I graduated, I probably had 5 short stories that were in my thesis, or I'd kind of say 4 stories in a novella. And then after I graduated, over the years, I would kind of pick it back up, look at it, and think about it again. And I ended up always making some very drastic change. And at some point, a couple years after I graduated from the MFA, I realized that it was one family, So I kind of revised all the stories so that they were all connected. And so, and I think it changed, the plot changed as things in my life changed. So I think at the point where I decided that the Abel Paisley character was going to be at the center of the novel and his secrets were going to be at the center of the novel, I think at that point my grandfather started to have dementia. And I think, thinking about his life and thinking about how secretive that generation was, really made me, start to think about, how has my grandfather's secrets shaped all of our lives.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and he didn't, his secrets weren't as extreme as Abel's, but, that's how it started.
Right. I wonder, about my own past. I'm sure as we all do. I was fortunate enough to know my grandmother on my mother's side. For a few short years of my life, she passed away when I was about 6 or 7, and excuse me, no, that's my paternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother on my mother's side, I knew until I was about 13. So I had a fairly decent relationship with her, and I wonder, I wish I could have a conversation with her now to tell me stories. So you're giving shape to stories, we kind of have to put pieces together.
Yeah, because it's a structure, for people who haven't read it, it's a novel in stories. So, each section can be read as its own self-contained story, but together it's kind of the story of a family and how, they were affected by Abel's decision.
And I'm interested to know about the character development because as a reader for my own self, I've had some trouble, not with your novel, but I've had some trouble kind of going back and forth between different characters. I don't want to say traditionally, but certainly authors before us are known for writing a book, introducing the plot, and you are introduced to a character, and then you have to kind of find them somewhere in the middle or towards the end of the book. But here you have it, you're kind of going back and forth. What kind of style of writing is that I'm seeing more in newer authors to give us such a rich story? Like, it's a page turner. It really is. And I'm not just saying that because you're here, but you kind of want to know what happens next without having to follow a story necessarily. You want to know. It's like having a conversation around the table, which is why I said in the beginning, I felt like it's an open letter that you'd written to a lot of us. So what made you introduce the characters the way that you did?
I think the structure is a bit non-traditional in that, it's not really about one central person. It's really about the whole family and multiple generations of the family, and really I would say at the center of the novel is kind of like trauma, and it's kind of just like the way that generational trauma, like how it kind of haunts us, like how it kind of manifests itself through our lives and we don't really recognize it. So all the characters tend to have this kind of like supernatural experience based on how they're experiencing, their trauma. But yeah, I think I wanted the structure to kind of match how I piece together information about my family and how other people do too. Like my maternal grandmother also died when I was young. And so, I think one of the first stories I wrote was inspired by my memory of going to her funeral when I was a little kid. And so, to her, when I went to that funeral, I had a different impression of her. And then over the years, I've heard different versions of her repeated through other people. So she's always been a kind of like enigma to me. I think when you're young, you just learn to process things or people in terms of good and bad. So sometimes I'll hear these stories and they're very negative, and it just always confused me growing up. Like how do I classify this person? And just people aren't, real people aren't really classifiable. They're not that simple. They're complicated. So I wanted, I guess I wanted to show that. And I guess you were talking about, like silence, the cultural silence. And I think, for me, this was me kind of imagining because even when my grandfather was alive, because he recently passed away a couple months ago, he just was known for not talking. And then, like, literally just being a quiet person. I almost feel like it's a familial trait. It's cultural and familial, like, we just don't talk that much. And then, you know, I've been talking to my mother, and she's been talking to, you know, his sisters, and they have been talking about their father, and they're saying, like, he was the same thing. He wouldn't say a word. He wouldn't give you any information about his past. You know, so it's like kind of, you know, I've kind of had to imagine answers to questions I've had. And
Piecing
so
the
this,
puzzle together.
yeah, so this book, yeah, is kind of a reflection of, you know, my experience processing my family and the changing relationships.
Okay. And you were born in St. Catherine, Jamaica,
Yeah.
which is a small parish outside of Kingston. And a lot of the story takes place in Kingston and Spanish Town. You make certain references to that area. Jamaica happens to be celebrating its independence on the day that we are interviewing, and it's 58 years since Jamaica has gained independence from England. And there's a lot, you know, that goes on with Jamaican culture. I think a lot of people identify with Jamaica as being the place to vacation.
Yeah.
My cousin on her Instagram, you know, on her bio line, she says, "I live in the place that you want to vacation." And so when we talk about people living in Jamaica and being there, a part of the culture, oftentimes there are people who leave Jamaica and who don't think of Jamaica once they leave. Can we go a little bit in terms of the history of Jamaica, the culture, maybe a little bit more specific? Let me go back. I love that you integrated patois into the text to make it a bit more conversational. So can we just go a little bit in terms of the culture and celebrating independence, because you do make reference to colorism.
Yeah.
The story itself, These Ghosts Are Family, is about colonialism, much of which we are continue to be oppressed by, even though some people don't want to recognize that. I'm going to take my glasses off because
Yeah, the masks. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about colorism and colonialism and those two isms as it relates to These Ghosts Are Family? If we can touch a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I was thinking of the impression that most people have of Jamaica when I was writing this, but I wanted to focus on, you know, the Jamaica that I know and that I've experienced both directly, you know, from living there and going there to visit family, but also, you know, indirectly through my family and kind of the stories they tell and their attitudes, their cultural attitudes. And so I think, you know, I think that I modeled the Paisley family a bit off of the maternal side of my family, and I think colorism is an issue on that side. You know, I wanted to kind of emphasize that, like, that Jamaica is a colonized country with a history of slavery, and because of that, you know, a lot of people now, I would say, unintentionally uphold white supremacy, you know, whether they want to or not. There are still similar beauty ideals as in all of the Western world. You know, so the character of Vera in the novel has kind of been taught to, you know, to kind of minimize her, like, African heritage and to heighten her European ancestry, despite the fact that, you know, part of that European ancestry came about because of slavery and the rape of slaves. So she kind of struggles with that, and so one of the stories is set during what's called Groundation Day, which is a Rastafarian holiday. It's when 1966, I believe, when Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, came to visit Jamaica. And, you know, I had been reading historical newspapers, and so I read all the newspapers from that day, you know, and you just sense that it was such a pivotal moment, because for once, you know, Jamaica was not celebrating the Queen of England. You know, we were celebrating a black man coming to a Jamaica and treating him as royalty, and Rastafarians who had been very oppressed up until that point, and are still very oppressed, I would say, in some ways, you know, felt validated in a way that they hadn't felt before. You know, so I wanted to show that. You know, one of the things too that struck me, because you end up doing research, meaning to do research on one thing, and then something else strikes you. So, you know, the history of Rastafarianism really struck me when I was doing research, and you know, it's just so ironic that I think to the West, to non-Jamaicans, it feels like Jamaicans think of non-Jamaicans think of Rastafarians as, you know, the culture, but within the culture they were so kind of brutally oppressed for a very long time because they celebrate African heritage, because they want to emphasize African heritage. You know, so there's these two ideologies that are constantly in conflict in Jamaican culture. You know, just recently they did the ruling that allowed them to ban a kid with dreadlocks from going to school if, you know, her parents didn't cut her hair. You know, so even though people keep thinking that history is not affecting us, it always comes back in one way or another.
And that's true to these ghosts.
Yeah.
That sometimes people don't want to talk about death and ghosts or duppies in that respect. But truly we rely on our past so much to tell our present stories, as I said, going back to putting the pieces together. I think we rely heavily on the ghosts that are a part of our family. And it's up to people like us, our generation, to start digging, doing research, and asking questions, and asking those questions that make our family uncomfortable. You know, we're now in a time, 2020 has not been kind to us from the beginning, but we are now in this era where we have to ask the questions that make people uncomfortable. And there's no more tiptoeing, and there's a lot of tiptoeing in Jamaican culture.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I should really ask this question, and I don't know. You mentioned your grandfather not being a man of many words. You know, there are so many people like that. You know, our elders, our grandparents, some of them have passed on, so we rely on our own parents or aunts and uncles, and still they hold on to that tradition, that ritual, that symbolism of not wanting to share information. I don't get it.
Yeah.
I don't, you know, because I'm from a generation that pushes the envelope a little bit, probably a lot. And I'm sure people can agree. But we are relying heavily on the ghosts of the past to help give shape to our family, to ourselves.
Yeah, like, I mean, I think a part of it too is because that generation was obviously given a very colonial education. You know, when they were being raised, they were taught to believe that they were subjects of the Queen, and like maybe they'd go to England one day, and like, you know, that was my grandfather's kind of like ideal. You know, he ended up coming to America, but some of his sister and his brother went to England. You know, and I think that I've heard a lot of stories since he died from his sisters that are, it's almost like, you know, about the history of their family, and it's because I realize they don't know. So they've kind of like made this kind of tale that's kind of a happier story, you know what I mean? And they've just held on to that as if that is the real story, but they don't, I realize that they don't know a lot about their past, and it's like, because so much you know, family history is available online, you know, I've been able to find like death certificates and birth certificates, and so I've figured out a lot of things that I think were secrets. You know, but I think at this age, you know, they're both in his two sisters are in their 80s, they don't want to like think about that, you know, so I mostly just discuss it with my mother. But yeah, I think for them, you know, it's painful to like confront the past.
I have a question for you. You know, a lot of times, both of us are librarians, and we pride ourselves in knowing how to identify reading skills in different types of people, especially when it concerns children and teens. Do you think this story could be brought to the stage of some sort, perhaps a small screen or a mini-series, to help tell the story of these ghosts, our family, and have people who may not perhaps want to read something like this, not necessarily your book, but would not want to read about their family in that way, do you think these ghosts, our family, would be brought to the small screen or?
You know, that would be really cool. I hope so.
I think it would be really, really cool.
Yeah, I'd never really seen a Jamaican. I'd seen a couple, you know, like I'd seen like the famous Jamaican movies growing up, like when Netflix started. Like, you know, I watched like Dance Hall Queen and like, you know, like Third World Cup and all those movies and The Harder They Come. But you know, I hadn't seen like a recently made, I think, film till. I saw the adaptation of White Teeth, the Zadie Smith Masterpiece Theater adaptation, and that was really interesting, like seeing, because one of the families in the book is Jamaican, seeing that a Jamaican family on just mainstream TV was like new to me, but it was very like revelatory too.
I'm telling you, I was reading this and I really did imagine myself in a small theater, you know, looking at the characters, going back and forth. It brought me, though he's a comedian, Oliver.
Oliver Samuels.
Yeah,
I used to watch that with my mom. Yeah.
Timeless comedian and a piece of Jamaican culture that if you know Oliver Samuels, then you know. If not, look him up. But when you look at his plays and his skits, certainly this isn't funny in any way. There's humor there.
Yeah.
But I see these ghosts are family in that type of a play, if you may.
I think one thing I wanted to incorporate it, or I don't think I intended to, but I think naturally, I do feel like even though I felt like my family was secretive, I do still feel like there's a part of Jamaica, there are certain things that we're comfortable talking about. I feel like death is one of them for some reason. Like I feel like my family's very comfortable talking about death and talking about subjects like that and making kind of like a bit of a joke out of it or laughing. So that's kind of, there's a kind of a dark humor in there that I feel like
death is a celebration in the Jamaican culture, in the West Indian culture. You know, 9 nights specifically to Jamaica, which is a celebration of the person who was passed on and their life. So I can see why they would feel that way. One last question before we open up the questions, and again, my colleague Michael Pucci will read the questions aloud. So if you have any questions, now's a good time to put them in the chat. But before we get there, one last question for you, Maisy.
Sure.
Do you see, actually 2 questions. Will there be an audio book of this available?
Oh, there is one. It's available. The narrator is Jamaican, actually. His name is Carl O'Brien Williams. And he's amazing. He has a very, very like wide range, and he's able to like adjust his voice for every character.
Okay.
So that's yeah. You could download that. I don't know if it's in the Buckle system, but
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But certainly, if you have your library card, no matter where you are, whether you're tuning in from out of New Jersey or within New Jersey, you get a library card, and your library does offer free ebooks with a library card to access ebooks and audiobooks. So you want to make sure that you look into that. Do you have any plans on writing a YA or young adult book?
I did have a plan, but I feel like I'm writing another book, which the idea or the concept of which I sold when I sold These Ghosts. So I have to write that first. But I did want to write a historical YA novel set in Newark. So.
Okay.
But I don't know when I'll get to that. But.
You know, you are right. You're getting such rave reviews, and they're so well deserved from the likes of Jacqueline Woodson and Jason Reynolds. And there's an article in The Atlantic that, I mean, you're out there. You are bringing Jamaica's culture and the stories of Jamaican families to the forefront. You know, I appreciate being a Jamaican daughter, that people want to go to Jamaica and visit and vacation and do all of the cool things. But it is my hope that people will continue to do those things, but also take some time to really learn about our culture, from Rastafarians to the Maroons to the many hills and valleys that are outside of, you know, the touristy spots. and sit down with the family and get to know them and allow them to share the culture with them beyond what they see, you know, in a local marketplace near a cruise ship or something.
Yeah.
So I thank you for bringing such a rich story to the mainstream and allowing people to be introduced and reminded also about the history of Jamaica. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's see what questions we have. And we can take maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Okay, we do have a question from our good friend Dustin. Her question is, how are you, Maisy, able to stay motivated writing the book for almost 12 years? Was it difficult?
Yeah, it was very difficult to stay motivated, actually. You know, and I think the reason why it took me so long is because sometimes I would lose motivation and I kind of would put it aside for a while. And I was also working a lot, and you know, I was in school and doing a lot of things, so I didn't have as much time. But I think what motivated me was when I actually started kind of setting goals and like sending my work out. Like, actually, I think when I started publishing sections of it, I had never really, I tried to get published before. I think that my first publication was 2014. There's this chapter called Estelle's Black Guy in this, and I started submitting that. And they usually say when you start writing, like, try to collect rejections. So I just kept sending it out, and I think I got like 80, 80 rejections. I probably sent it out over 2 years. So I got published on the second round. And so just getting published that bit, even it was a very indie journal, but it really like made me feel like that extra boost that I needed to continue. Because I think the hardest part is feeling like nobody's waiting for what you're writing, and so it doesn't make you like really want to rush or work on it consistently. So I think after I got that section published, I said I'm going to try to get a part of the book published every year, at least one part. And so I was able to for the next couple of years, and so that kind of helped me stay motivated to finish, to keep writing and finish. And also one thing I did to stay motivated too, which is probably why the book has multiple styles, is that sometimes I'd make like a very drastic change. Like I would feel like whenever I felt like I was getting bored writing it, I would try to do something, a very drastic shift to make me a bit more interested in what I was writing. So it could be like, writing a story in second person, or seeing how I can incorporate this like theme of the supernatural in different ways.
Okay, we have another question. Are there any books you read recently that you would recommend? And maybe a sub-question for me is, what were the main influences for this book?
Okay. Some books that I read recently that I definitely recommend is Lakewood by Megan Giddings. I recently did an event with her. That book it's amazing. It's also very, like, I feel like it's timely. It hits on real topics. It's about a black woman who is a college student whose grandmother died, and her mother has kind of a debilitating illness, so she agrees to participate in a medical research study in this little town called Lakewood, and it ends up being this kind of major thriller. It's also a really good page turner. And another book that came out this week is Luster. It's called Luster by Raven Leilani. She's also of Caribbean descent. It's about an African American woman in New York, like in her 20s, who wants to be an artist. It's good. It's actually one of the best books I've read in a while. Those two. And yeah, there's so many. Patsy, if you want other Jamaican fiction, Patsy by Nicole Dennis Ben, I thought was really, really amazing. And it really told a story that I also felt was very like a lot of Caribbean people would understand, but for some reason doesn't really get written about a lot. So I thought that was really good.
What was your question, Michael?
Oh, well, were there books or authors that you served as influences in writing your novel?
Yeah, I really liked, I think one of the first books that made me kind of want to write about a Caribbean family was White Teeth by Zadie Smith. that was also a multi-generational novel, and at that time I'd never read a multi-generational novel with the Caribbean family before, so that was the influence. Also Toni Morrison, just all her work, but I think in particular Beloved and A Mercy, those two novels, and then a lot of Jamaican novels. The work of Michelle Cliff, she's a Jamaican writer, was a big inspiration too. And yeah, those are the main, I guess, the main influences.
Okay.
And I always read Marlon James, so I would say Marlon James too, because for a while he was like the author that I always like sought out.
Okay. Well, Maisy, thank you so very much for joining us today. I'm so glad to have you be a part of our summer programming, which, by the way, is Imagine Your Story, which is not just for the state of New Jersey, but all across the country. And certainly, you imagined a story that is now on bookshelves pretty much anywhere you go. But I will say you should come to the library and you should check it out. I can't promise it'll be here because it's constantly being circulated. There are tons of holds on it, but make sure that you support your local bookstore and you can purchase a copy. And we have a copy here available for you as well. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who have joined us on this Jamaican Independence. I didn't even mention my outfit, but this is the national dress for Jamaica, which can be worn in different varieties, but certainly with the head bandana, it can be a full dress or a skirt and blouse. But this is in honor of Jamaican independence, so happy independence to all of my fellow Jamaicans, Jamaican Americans, and thank you, Michael, my colleague, for being in the background, bringing the questions to the forefront. We hope that you all are safe and well, you and your families. Continue to be safe. Please wear your mask and have a great evening. Enjoy the rest of the summer. Thank you so much, Maisy Card.
Thank you.